York, this is Democracy Now!
And that's when we heard the words of the President of the United States that stunned the world and shocked the conscience of this nation. He said there were, quote, some very fine people on both sides. Very fine people on both sides.
Former Vice President Joe Biden enters the presidential race, saying he was inspired to run after President Trump's reaction to the deadly white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017. We'll speak to reporter Andrew Cohen about what he calls Biden's disastrous legislative legacy. Coburn's recent piece in Harper's is headlined, No Joe. But first, rhetoric versus reality, how the most precise air campaign in history left Raqqa the most destroyed city in modern times.
When I first came to Raqqa after the war, I knew that relentless American, British and French bombardment had killed civilians and destroyed much of the city during the battle to oust ISIS. But what I came to discover was that little or no protection was afforded to the thousands of civilians who were trapped in the city.
Amnesty International is estimating more than 1,600 civilians were killed in the U.S.-led offensive in Raqqa, Syria, as troops fired more artillery into Raqqa than anywhere since the Vietnam War. Then Eddie G. puts the laughter in manslaughter. That was the message scrawled on the wall of a kill site in Mosul, Iraq. We'll look at a New York Times expose dealing how Navy SEALs who witnessed their platoon leader, Eddie Gallagher, commit war crimes in Iraq were encouraged not to speak out and told they could lose their jobs for reporting him. Gallagher goes on trial for murder next month. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump pushed closer toward a constitutional crisis with Congress Wednesday, vowing to fight all subpoenas from House Democrats ordering current and former aides to testify on Capitol Hill. Trump's remarks came as the White House continued to suggest the president may invoke executive privilege to prevent former White House counsel Don McGahn from testifying publicly to the House Judiciary Committee on May 21st.
Well, the subpoena is ridiculous. I have been the most transparent president and administration in the history of our country by far. We're fighting all the subpoenas. Look, these aren't like impartial people. The Democrats are trying to win 2020.
House Oversight Committee Chair Elijah Cummings said aides who defy subpoenas could be held in contempt of Congress, warning, quote, these employees and their personal attorneys should think very carefully about their own legal interests rather than being swept up in the obstruction schemes of the Trump administration, unquote. House Judiciary Chair Gerald Nadler has suggested fining officials personally if they refuse to testify to his committee. In Afghanistan, the United Nations says U.S.-backed Afghan security forces have killed more civilians so far this year than the Taliban. The new UN figures show that between January and March, anti-government fighters killed 227 civilians, while Afghan and international forces killed 305 civilians. The report also found U.S. and NATO airstrikes have killed 145 civilians so far in 2019, half of them women and children. Meanwhile, a major new investigation by Amnesty International and Air Wars has revealed the U.S.-led military coalition in Syria killed more than 1,600 civilians during the 2017 offensive to oust ISIS militants from the city of Raqqa. Amnesty is calling on the U.S. and coalition nations to fully investigate the mass civilian casualties. After headlines, we'll go to London to speak with Donatella Rivera, the exposé's lead investigator. In Hong Kong, hundreds of activists held a candlelight vigil Wednesday outside the prison where 4 protest leaders have been ordered to serve 16-month sentences for organizing pro-democracy demonstrations in 2014. 4 other activists received suspended sentences, while a 9th had her sentencing trial delayed for health reasons. The so-called umbrella movement brought hundreds of thousands of protesters into the streets of Hong Kong to oppose the Chinese government's plans to only allow candidates approved by Beijing to run for office. They were ultimately unsuccessful as Chinese officials continue a rollback of the policy known as one country, 2 systems that grants greater freedoms and political autonomy to Hong Kong. Sri Lankan police are on high alert amidst fresh bomb scares in the wake of Easter Sunday attacks that killed 359 people and injured more than 500. Overnight, authorities arrested 16 more suspects in the case. Among those arrested so far is Mohammed Yusuf Ibrahim, one of Sri Lanka's richest spice traders. Authorities say 2 of his sons were among 8 suicide bombers who died in Sunday's attacks. On Wednesday, Sri Lanka's president sacked the country's police chief and defense secretary amidst widespread reports that security forces had ample warnings about imminent attacks ahead of the bombings, but failed to act. The United Nations has condemned Saudi Arabia's mass public execution this week of 37 prisoners, some of whom were convicted based on confessions extracted through torture. This is UN human rights spokesperson Ravina Shamdasani.
We had concerns about confessions that had been extracted through torture. We had concerns that the due process and the fair trial rights of the individuals had not been respected. And in at least 3 cases, the individuals who were executed yesterday were sentenced to death when they were minors. And this is completely unacceptable in international human rights law. So we utterly condemn the executions carried out yesterday by Saudi Arabia.
Back in the United States, Texas has executed one of 3 white supremacists convicted of killing an African-American man from more than 2 decades ago in a modern-day lynching that shocked the conscience of the nation and led to state and federal hate crime laws. In June of 1998, 49-year-old Jasper resident James Byrd was chained to a pickup truck and dragged to his death. James Byrd was African-American. The 3 men who murdered him were white. One of the men, John William King, was killed Wednesday evening by a prison official in Huntsville who injected him with a single lethal dose of the sedative pentobarbital. King was an avowed racist covered in tattoos depicting Nazi imagery, a lynching, and the words Aryan pride. He was the 2nd man to be executed for James Byrd's murder. A 3rd man serving a life sentence for the murder is due for a parole hearing in 2034. Former Vice President Joe Biden has formally entered the 2020 race for the White House, becoming the 20th Democrat to seek the nomination, the largest field ever for the party. In a campaign video released on social media this morning, Biden took aim at President Trump's response to the 2017 Unite the Right March of White Nationalists in Charlottesville, Virginia, and the killing of the anti-racist protester Heather Heyer.
It was there on August of 2017 we saw Klansmen and white supremacists and neo-Nazis come out in the open. Their crazed faces, illuminated by torches, veins bulging and bearing the fangs of racism, chanting the same anti-Semitic bile heard across Europe in the 30s. And they were met by a courageous group of Americans, and a violent clash ensued. And a brave young woman lost her life. And that's when we heard the words of the President of the United States that stunned the world and shocked the conscience of this nation. He said there were, quote, some very fine people on both sides. Very fine people on both sides?
As a longtime senator from Delaware, Joe Biden previously ran twice for the Democratic nomination. Biden's 1994 crime bill, while implementing sweeping gun control, also helped fuel mass incarceration with financial incentives to keep people behind bars. Biden has long faced criticism for his handling of Anita Hill's sexual harassment allegations against Supreme Court Justice nominee Clarence Thomas in 1991. At the time, Biden was the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Biden is known for close ties to the financial industry, notably helping push through a 2005 bill that made it harder for consumers to declare bankruptcy. He also voted to authorize the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. We'll have more on Joe Biden's record as a senator and vice president later in the broadcast with journalist Andrew Coburn. The New York Times is reporting that before she left her post as head of the Department of Homeland Security, Kirstjen Nielsen sought repeatedly to sound the alarm over Russian interference in the election, but was ordered not to bring it up in front of the president. As DHS Secretary, Nielsen was tasked with overseeing the nation's civilian cyber defenses. But according to the New York Times, Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney made it clear that Trump still equated any public discussion of malign Russian election activity with questions about about the legitimacy of his victory. Nielsen resigned earlier this month after overseeing Trump's zero-tolerance immigration policy that's seen children separated from their parents and entire families held in cages resembling dog kennels. In Brazil, thousands of indigenous people and their allies are rallying in the capital, Brasilia, protesting a massive assault on their rights and territories by ranchers, miners, and the government of far-right President Jair Bolsonaro. This is Kawau Apurina of the Aputina tribe.
We are tired of being murdered. We are tired of not having our lands demarcated. We are tired of this genocide, ecocide with the indigenous peoples. We're defending the planet.
The protest comes as new data from the World Resources Institute show nearly 9 million acres of pristine rainforest were cut down in 2018, with most of the destruction caused by clear-cutting in the Amazon. The data show deforestation is still on an upward trend, with losses accelerating in Brazil, where loggers and cattle ranchers are pressing further into indigenous territories aided by the government. And in Belfast, funeral services were held Wednesday for the Northern Irish journalist Lyra McKee, who was shot in the head by an Irish nationalist militant last week during riots in the city of Derry. Leaders from both sides of Northern Ireland's political divide appeared side by side at the funeral. They were joined by British officials and leaders from the Republic of Ireland and St. Anne's Protestant Cathedral. At Wednesday's funeral, a friend revealed that just hours before she was murdered, Lyra McKee said she was about to propose marriage to her partner, Sarah Canning. A group calling itself the New IRA, which opposes the 1998 Belfast Agreement peace accord, has claimed responsibility for her murder, though it didn't identify the shooter. Ahead of Wednesday's funeral, Sinn Féin President Mary Lou McDonald condemned the assassination.
So it's past time now for these groups that masquerade as Republicans to pack up and pack it in, to end their activities and to let the people get on with the work of building a new united Ireland, that Ireland that we all want, an Ireland that will be a tribute to our patriot dead and to all who died, the Ireland in which Lyra McKee should have lived.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Narmeen Sheikh. Welcome to our listeners and viewers around the country and around the world. We begin today's show in Syria. A major new investigation by Amnesty International and Air Wars has revealed the U.S.-led military coalition killed more than 1,600 civilians during the 2017 offensive to oust ISIS militants from the Syrian city of Raqqa. The coalition launched thousands of airstrikes and tens of thousands of artillery strikes on the city. U.S. troops fired more artillery into Raqqa than anywhere since the Vietnam War. At the time, the United States claimed it was the, quote, most precise air campaign in history. Amnesty is calling on the U.S. and coalition nations to fully investigate the mass civilian casualties. Amnesty International's Donatella Rovera traveled to Raqqa to speak with survivors.
So this is where we're going, because this is one of the bases where U.S. forces had the artillery battery, and they were firing from there volleys of unguided artillery shells into Raqqa. I didn't come to Raqqa with any preconceived ideas of, what had or had not happened. It's a journey of, discovering what happened. When I first came to Raqqa after the war, I knew that relentless American, British and French bombardment had killed civilians and destroyed much of the city during the battle to oust ISIS. But what I came to discover was that little or no protection was afforded to the thousands of civilians who were trapped in the city.
While Amnesty International's Donatella Rivera was in Syria, she spoke with a woman named Ayat, whose entire family was killed in an airstrike.
My children, my husband, my mother, my sister, my niece, my whole family. I've lost them all, my dearest ones. We were sitting in the basement when the rocket hit just before sunset. When it hit my face, was burnt by the flames. My neighbor was in front of me and was left totally charred. When I came round, my son was screaming. He was in pain, but I couldn't help him. He was screaming, "Mommy, help me." I told him, "I can't, my son. I can't help you." I was burnt. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't move my hands or feet. I wasn't able to help him. He suffered until morning and then died. Those who can't afford the missiles that kill children can afford to help. What was this war? Wasn't the goal to free civilians? They were supposed to save us, to protect our children.
Those were the words of a Syrian woman named Ayat. A U.S.-led coalition airstrike killed her entire family. We go now to London, where we're joined by Donatella Rivera, the senior crisis response advisor at Amnesty International. She was the lead investigator of the investigation by Amnesty and Air Wars titled Rhetoric versus Reality: How the Most Precise Air Campaign in History Left Raqqa the Most Destroyed City in Modern Times. Donatella Rivera, welcome to Democracy Now! Just explain the level of the devastation and the involvement of the United States.
The devastation is clear for all to see. There is not a single neighborhood in Raqqa that was spared. There is more than 11,000 buildings that were destroyed or damaged all over the city. People are living in the middle of the ruins. As for the level of responsibility of the United States, they were the lead party in this military operation that involved also UK and French forces, but more than 90% of the airstrikes were carried out by US forces, and all of the artillery strikes were carried out by US forces. So the US was by far the overwhelming power in this military operation that caused so many civilian casualties that could have been avoided.
Donatella, could you explain exactly what this investigation entailed and what your findings were?
We spent weeks and months in Raqqa just in the past year. I've been back to Raqqa 4 times for weeks at a time, visited more than 200 sites of coalition strikes and interviewed more than 400 witnesses and survivors, and carried out on-the-ground investigation beyond just collecting testimonies. So, for example, I went to scrapyards to find how much they had received by way of used artillery shells and other pieces of munitions. And then, as well as the on-the-ground investigation, we carried out very extensive remote sensing with our evidence lab. We had a project whereby thousands of volunteers examined more than 2 million satellite image frames. We examined every single scrap of information that was available on open sources. And the findings of all that is that we were able to verify on the ground more than 640 civilian killed. And the rest, up to 1,600, are cases where we have names, where we have very strong and credible reports. The same is also the same information has also been collected by Air Wars. So we have done a very large part of the job that the coalition should have done and has not done until now. They have not been in Raqqa investigating on the ground, speaking to survivors and witnesses to try and find out what the impact of the military operation that they carried out has had on the civilian population. Our investigation shows 2 things. First, it is not a question of some individual isolated cases. It is way more widespread than that. Entire families, time and time again, were wiped out. 10 people here, 20 people there, 30 people in another building, and so on. And secondly, our investigation shows that it is possible to do this kind of investigation on a large scale in Raqqa. It is not always the case in a post-war theater, but it is possible to do so in Raqqa. Therefore, there is no impediment and therefore no reason why the US-led coalition has not been willing to do a proper investigation so that facts can be established, they can take responsibility, because until now the coalition has only admitted to roughly 10% of the civilian casualties they've caused. And that's not good enough, frankly. 18 months have passed since the end of the war. It is time for the coalition to be transparent, to come clean, to take its responsibility for the civilian casualties that it has caused, and to provide reparation to the victims.
You say that U.S. Marines boast they'd fired more artillery into Raqqa than any time since Vietnam. One U.S. military official boasted about firing 30,000 artillery rounds during the campaign, the equivalent of a strike every 6 minutes for 4 months straight, surpassing the amount of artillery used in any conflict since the Vietnam War. Donatella.
That is deeply worrying. I mean, obviously, this was said by U.S. Marines on the record. It's nothing to be proud of, because artillery is a battlefield weapon. It is not meant for urban area. Every artillery shell has a margin of error of 100 meters or more, and we all know that in a city where there are civilians, even just 10 meters can make the difference between a legitimate military target and a house full of civilians. So, artillery is cheap, but it is very costly in terms of civilian lives when used in areas around civilians. It should never be used around civilians. And when it comes to the air-delivered munitions, the air bombardments that were carried out by the coalition forces, the munitions were precise, but were very wide impact radius. Munitions, big MK-type bombs that took out entire buildings, 6-7 floor buildings were taken out with civilians inside. Again, those bombs are not your most sophisticated piece of kit that it's at the disposal of U.S. forces. They could have used more precise, likely more expensive and requiring more labor-intensive to use, but it would have been possible to achieve their military objectives without causing so much harm to civilian. And secondly, the importance of the quality of the intelligence, because ultimately precision munitions are only as precise as the intelligence is. And the question is whether the coalition forces put all the time and resources that they should have and could have put in to verify the target. Because if time and time again, throughout the entire military operation, we had entire buildings taken out with, tens of civilians killed, something went horribly wrong. And it should be for the coalition to show an interest 18 months after the end of the war in understanding what went wrong, so that the same mistakes won't be repeated the next time, because lessons should be learned from what has been a very tragic military campaign for so many families in Raqqa.
Donatella, the report is also titled, as you pointed out, the air campaign used relatively precise weapons despite the resulting devastation, irrespective of their precision. But the artillery fire resulted in so many of these civilian deaths. And the report says that Raqqa was the most destroyed city in modern times. You've spent time both in Aleppo and in Mosul, both of which, of course, were almost entirely destroyed in war, in coalition airstrikes and NATO airstrikes. Can you talk about what happened in Raqqa that distinguishes it from these two previous wars? In Aleppo and in Mosul, Iraq, Aleppo, Syria?
It's the scale, really. In Mosul, we saw the old city, which is a small percentage of the city, that was entirely destroyed. In Aleppo, we saw the part of Aleppo that was under rebel control that was very largely destroyed. in percentage term, Raqqa is another story, because in Raqqa it's not one neighborhood or a few neighborhoods. The destruction is everywhere. We've published a map that shows satellite imagery. It's clear to see there isn't a single neighborhood that was spared. So in terms of percentage, I mean, obviously Mosul is a much bigger city than Raqqa. The destruction there was concentrated in the old city, which is a small percentage of the city of Mosul, thankfully. And again, in Aleppo, it was part of the city. In Raqqa, the destruction is everywhere. I have been working in a conflict situation all over the Middle East and Africa for the past 2 decades, and I haven't seen this level of destruction in percentage term anywhere else.
Amnesty International Strike Trackers project identified more than each of the 11,000 destroyed buildings in Raqqa hit using this project. 3,000 digital activists in 124 countries. What did they do to determine this?
Basically, we had a project that involved online volunteers examining satellite image frames to locate the precise time when each building was destroyed. And every task was performed by multiple people, so there was a lot of peer review, and then, of course, the final information was reviewed by our qualified analyst. The importance of that project was that it allowed us to scale up the analysis of a very, very large volume of satellite imagery. That was important in understanding how the battle unfolded, troop movements, where the destruction was, and against where troop movements and the front lines were. So that was a very important component, and that is what makes this particular investigation different than what we've done before. It's a multidimensional investigation because it involves both very extensive work investigating on the ground, but also very innovative technology and considerable resources put into the remote sensing, looking at the satellite imagery on a very large scale and all the available information on open sources. And we've also done this in partnership with other organizations such as Air Wars and Syrian Archives, whereby we've pulled together our data and the data that they had been collecting remotely throughout the time of the military operation. And we're also visualizing this particular, the findings of this investigation in a different way. It's not the usual report. It's a platform. It's a site that will be live and that contains a lot of audiovisual material that people can explore. There is 360
and Donatella, we will link
videos.
to it. We'll link to it at democracynow.org. Donatella Rivera, Senior Crisis Response Advisor at Amnesty International, lead investigator of this extensive online resource that's just been published, headlined Rhetoric versus Reality, How the Most Precise Air Campaign in History Left Raqqa the Most Destroyed City in Modern Time. When we come back, former Vice President Joe Biden enters the 2020 presidential race. We'll speak with journalist Andrew Coburn. Stay with us.
Sailing down my dirty stream, still I love it, and I'll keep the dream that someday, though maybe not this year, my Hudson River will once again run clear. It starts high in the mountains of the north, crystal clear, and icy trickles forth, with just a few floating wrappers of chewing gum, dropped by some hikers to warn of things to come. At Glens Falls, 5,000 honest hands work at the consolidated paper plan. 5
The late
million
Pete Seeger singing
gallons
My
of
Dirty Stream, the Hudson River Song. That's a never-before-released version of a song that appears on a forthcoming Smithsonian Folkways box set to mark the 100th anniversary of Pete Seeger's birth, May 3rd, 1919. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
Former Vice President Joe Biden has entered the 2020 race for the White House, becoming the 20th Democrat to seek the nomination in the largest and most diverse field of Democratic candidates to ever run for president. Biden will hold his first fundraiser tonight in Philadelphia. It will be hosted by Comcast chief lobbyist David Cohen.
In a campaign video released on social media this morning, Biden took aim at President Trump's response to the 2017 Unite the Right March of white nationalists in Charlottesville. He began by talking about Charlottesville, the home of Thomas Jefferson, and then went on to talk about what happened most recently.
It was there on August of 2017 we saw Klansmen and white supremacists and neo-Nazis come out in the open. Their crazed faces, illuminated by torches, veins bulging and bearing the fangs of racism, chanting the same anti-Semitic bile heard across Europe in the 30s. And they were met by a courageous group of Americans, and a violent clash ensued. And a brave young woman lost her life. And that's when we heard the words of the President of the United States that stunned the world and shocked the conscience of this nation. He said there were, quote, some very fine people on both sides. Very fine people on both sides? With those words, the President of the United States assigned a moral equivalence between those spreading hate and those with the courage to stand against it. And in that moment, I knew the threat to this nation was unlike any I had ever seen in my lifetime.
That's Joe Biden announcing his run for president. As a longtime senator from Delaware, Biden has run twice before for the Democratic nomination. The last time was in 2008 when he ultimately became then-Senator Barack Obama's running mate. Biden's third bid for the presidency comes in a Democratic political climate that is notably more progressive than the last time he sought the nomination. Biden will face scrutiny for his long and checkered record in the coming weeks, including his 1994 crime bill that helped fuel mass incarceration with financial incentives to keep people behind bars. Biden has also long faced criticism for his handling of Anita Hill's sexual harassment allegations against Supreme Court Justice nominee Clarence Thomas in 1991. At the time, Biden was the chair of the Senate Judiciary Committee. Biden is also known for close ties to the financial industry, notably helping push through a 2005 bill that made it harder for consumers to declare bankruptcy. According to the New York Times, the credit card issuer MBNA was Biden's top donor from 1989 to 2010.
One of Biden's key legislative achievements was the 2005 bankruptcy law that made it harder to reduce student debt, preventing most Americans from claiming bankruptcy protections for private student loans. He also voted to authorize the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003. In the weeks before Biden announced his bid for the presidency, at least 7 women stepped forward to accuse him of inappropriate touching. Well, last month I spoke with Andrew Coburn, Washington editor for Harper's Magazine, about Biden's potential run for the presidency, and his recent piece headlined "No Joe. Joe Biden's Disastrous Legislative Legacy" was the subtitle. I began in part 2 of this discussion by asking Andrew Coburn about Biden's role in the 1994 crime bill.
He teamed up with Strom Thurmond, this sort of very aged old segregationist from South Carolina. Really the face of the face of everything that we'd been trying to get away from. And it was really, Joe, he thought this was going to really propel him to the top. As he said to a former aide who told me, I think it was around about 1990, the aide was telling me how Joe was always trying to hold hearings on crime and drugs. Every week, his poor staff had to sit around dreaming up a new excuse for a hearing on crime and drugs. And as Biden said to his staffer, he said, when people hear the words crime and drugs, I want them to think Joe Biden. I mean, he was really running, like George Bush Sr. on a sort of Willie Horton. It's astonishing that this man, this politician, should be considered a front runner for the Democrats.
Now, could he simply say he's changed since then, that he's completely reversed his position?
Well, not really. I mean, he's flubbed on a few things. I mean, he changed, he's apologized for a few things. Not, I note, on busing. Not on choice, where his record is truly terrible. He has said that he's kind of sorry, a bit sorry about his crime legislation, and he said he's sorry he voted for the financial deregulation, the key repeal of Glass-Steagall. He said that was the worst vote ever of his entire career, which there's a lot of competition there. So, but even if, just thinking of his political viability, supposing he has to go through the campaign saying, well, I'm sorry I did what I did on busing, I'm sorry I did what I did on crime, I'm sorry I did what I did on banks, he's going to sound like another shifty politician.
And on Anita Hill, I'm sorry what I did on Anita Hill.
I'm really sorry about Anita Hill. He's expressed some regret for that, I should admit. So, basically his record has very little that's good about it. He has this sort of shtick of being the friend of the working man, but, he's been much better and closer friend of the financial industry.
Talk about what happened with Neil Kinnock, the speech.
Well, very bizarre that. Neil Kinnock, who at that time was the leader of the Labour Party, had this, standard stump speech in Britain, British Labour Party, and he would, in his stump speech, he would say that, why was it that he was the first Kinnock in 1,000 years to go to college, and Mrs. Kinnock, I think he invoked too, as being the first from her family to go to college. And he made a moving sort of rags to riches sort of piece out of that. And Biden heard this, or his speechwriter did, and thought, that sounds good, and simply substituted the word Biden. Why am I the first Biden in 1,000 years to go to college? And so on and so forth. And what's particularly ironic about it is that Neil Kinnock was known in Britain as the Welsh windbag, because he went on. And, of course, Biden himself is a terrible windbag. So it was really bizarre to have one windbag plagiarizing another.
I wanted to talk about Iraq. In 2002, former chief UN weapons inspector in Iraq, Scott Ritter, said, quote, Senator Joe Biden's running a sham hearing. It's clear Biden and most of the congressional leadership have preordained a conclusion that seeks to remove Saddam Hussein from power regardless of the facts, and are using these hearings to provide political cover for a massive military attack on Iraq. These hearings have nothing to do with an objective search for the truth, but rather seek to line up like-minded witnesses who will buttress this predetermined result, Ritter said. That same year, in 2002, Senator Biden said, quote, we must be clear with the American people that we're committing to Iraq for the long haul, not just the day after, but the decade after. I'm absolutely confident the president will not take us to war alone, he said. Talk about the significance of that then, and then what it could mean for today.
Well, it fits into, Biden's, worldview or behavior on the international stage throughout, which is as a very hardline hawk. As you just said, as Ritter said at the time, Biden was really doing everything he could to assist George Bush in the run-up to the illegal invasion of Iraq. On the Foreign Relations Committee, he summoned just, pro-invasion witnesses. As far as I know, he was certainly not one of the famous of the 5 senators who took the trouble to go down and read the national intelligence estimate that Senator Bob Graham has talked about, which was locked away down in the basement, which would have told them that there was a lot of doubts in the intelligence community as to whether Saddam had weapons of mass destruction and so forth. No, he just, he wanted. He was all for war, and he was all for occupation, as you said. And that fits in with, his record since. He's most notably As vice president, Obama made Vice President Biden, gave him really the Iraq file, but also the Ukraine file. And Biden used that to be an ardent proponent of, more arms for Ukraine, for intervention in what is really a civil war in Ukraine. Of course, his family, his son, had very extensive business ties in Ukraine, which doesn't look too good. His son, Hunter, was on the board of the Ukrainian gas company. So, Biden, whenever he's been given the chance, he's been for armed intervention. He was ardently for the expansion of NATO, the post 1990 in the 1990s, which is really the root cause of the renewed sort of the new Cold War. I mean, Biden was there. It's no surprise that he describes John McCain as his best friend in the Senate.
Biden also said in 2002, "I do not believe this is a rush to war. I believe it's a march to peace and security." So, Andrew Coburn, if you could comment on his two runs for president, both failed. All the media is saying the polls show he's the, number one now, followed by Bernie Sanders. But, of course, he's got the biggest name recognition nationally. He was vice president for 8 years under President Obama.
Well, that's right. I mean, it is largely a factor of name recognition. But also, I mean, we have to think about those two runs and what it showed. First of all, there was, as we've discussed, this astonishing gaffe in 1988, where it wasn't just plagiarizing this British politician, by the way. It turned out that his speeches also had extensive passages lifted from Bobby Kennedy and Martin Luther King, unbelievably. So it's kind of, it's hard to explain. It's really a sort of mental issue. But then that sank it's not clear that his campaign was going anywhere anyway at that time. And then in 2008, he didn't even have that excuse of a plagiarism. I mean, he made an astonishing remark about Barack Obama early on, where he described him as clean. I mean, it was a very sort of racist, almost racist-sounding, patronizing remark. And he got nowhere. He really sputtered, and his campaign sputtered and died. So it's pretty bizarre to me, this sort of cheering squad for Biden, run, Joe, run. And I think, actually, what clip you showed, featured of him at the firefighters convention yesterday, was very telling, because it sounded like I can hear Donald Trump invoking, low energy again. He didn't sound like a ready to go politician at all to me. He sounded sort of rather weary. I have the feeling sometimes that in his heart, he doesn't want to do it. That's why we've had this sort of Hamlet performance for months now. And the people around him, all these longtime aides, this is their chance for, a ticket in the big game, to be in on a big-time presidential campaign, and they're kind of pushing him into it. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think, if he does run, those poll numbers will come down in a hurry. He's not an effective campaigner. He hates preparation. He hates, debate prep. He's not a great fundraiser. He doesn't like having to sort of kowtow to big donors to get money. He's got such an inflated ego. I really think that I'm not the only person saying this. People who've known him for a long time think the same, that what he really wants is to be anointed. Please, Mr. Biden, please come and be our candidate. Please come and be our president, without having to go through the hard grind, the incredible exhaustion of a modern presidential campaign.
Andrew, could you talk about the media's coverage of him? You were really among the first, if not the first one, in this period to start really seriously analyzing Joe Biden's record as a senator and then as a vice president. Then the rest of the media started, repeating some of what you had to say.
Well, yes. Oh, thank you. But that is true. But I mean, now they're all busy at work, like, the CNN digging out that very damning clip you played earlier. And there's going to be a lot more of that. I mean, already there's, things I didn't know that are coming up. And just imagine what it's going to be like when he has 12 other Democrats, sort of chasing him around the ring. It's going to be like Lord of the Flies or something. It's, the people, Oppo research can be pretty good these days, and there's a lot to come out. And he has so many deficiencies as a candidate, including, I should say, because the Republicans are already saying it, a Me Too problem. I mean, if you look on sort of Republican websites and Twitter accounts, there's a montage going around of Joe Biden with women at photo ops, including some quite young women, children really, apparently fondling them. I'm sure it's all very just avuncular and everything, but as one political fundraiser and operative said to me, a lady said I was never talking to him, but he wasn't stroking my back. He's very tactile, which I'm sure is entirely innocent, but don't think that the Republicans won't make a lot of hay with that, and probably his Democratic rivals too.
That's Andrew Coburn, Washington editor for Harper's Magazine. To see part one of our discussion, go to democracynow.org. When we come back, we look at a New York Times expose detailing how Navy SEALs who witnessed their platoon chief, Eddie Gallagher, commit war crimes in Iraq were encouraged by their superiors not to speak out and told they could lose their jobs for reporting him. Gallagher goes on trial for murder next month. We'll speak with New York Times journalist Dave Phillips. Stay with us. Longing by Nova Imad. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
The New York Times is reporting that Navy SEALs who witnessed their platoon chief commit war crimes in Iraq were encouraged not to speak out and told they could lose their jobs for reporting him at a private meeting with a superior officer last year. According to a confidential Navy criminal investigation obtained by the Times, the commandos said they saw Special Operations Chief Edward Gallagher stab and kill an unarmed teenage captive, shoot to death a young girl and old man, and fire indiscriminately into crowds of civilians. But when the men on Gallagher's team called a private meeting with their troop commander and demanded an investigation, they were told to stay quiet on the matter and no action was taken. The group of 7 SEALs eventually were able to force an investigation, and Chief Edward Gallagher was arrested in September on more than a dozen charges, including premeditated murder and attempted murder.
The court-martial centers on a charge that Gallagher stabbed to death a teenage member of the Islamic State while the unarmed youth was being treated by a medic. Gallagher allegedly also photographed members of his platoon posing with the corpse in what was dubbed a re-enlistment ceremony. Gallagher then reportedly texted a photo of the dead captive to another SEAL saying, quote, "Good story behind this. Got him with my hunting knife." According to legal filings obtained by the Navy Times, 2 other SEAL petty officers have said Gallagher bragged about killing, quote, 10 to 20 people a day or 150 to 200 people on deployment. A fellow sniper told investigators Gallagher claimed, quote, he averaged 3 kills a day over 80 days. The investigation also unveiled the words Eddie G. puts the laughter in manslaughter were once scrawled on the wall of a kill site in Mosul, Iraq. Gallagher's trial begins May 28th. If convicted, he could face life in prison. The Navy's also charged Gallagher's boss for failing to report a war crime and for destroying evidence. Joining us now from Colorado Springs, Colorado, is the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Dave Phillips, national correspondent for The New York Times. His latest piece, headline, Navy SEALs were warned against reporting their chief for war crimes. Dave Phillips, welcome to Democracy Now! This is an explosive piece. Tell us about how you found out, how you discovered the story. What happened to this platoon and their allegations?
Well, thanks for having me on. The story, of course, first came to my attention when he was arrested and charged. Whenever a chief of a platoon is arrested and charged with manslaughter and murder, you immediately pay attention and try and figure out what's going on behind the scenes, because as grim as it may sound, it would be very easy to make this type of thing go away if everyone was on board. You can imagine a platoon in a place like Mosul. If someone wanted to kill someone who didn't necessarily fall into the legal parameters, that could happen and no one would say anything if everyone was okay with it. But what struck me is that there was a schism in this platoon where clearly there were people who were not okay with what was going on and thought their chief had gone over the line. So when I saw his arrest, I really wanted to see what was going on behind the scenes. And I was lucky enough to get a really rare look at these confidential documents, about 500 pages of Navy criminal investigation that interviewed these SEALs, that included hundreds of text messages from the chief's seized phone. And they really gave us almost unprecedented look at how these things unfolded. And as you mentioned at the top, there was a lot of details in there of killing, of indiscriminate shooting. But what also struck me over and over again is you have one SEAL who is accused of doing things that went beyond the law and murdering people. But then you have 7 SEALs at least who stood up and said, this is wrong, our superior is doing something wrong, and they did what they are supposed to do. They, according to the documents and what they told investigators, they went to their chain of command and tried for months to get an investigation started. And they were told, I think, I don't know what the motivation behind it was, but they were told, look, decompress, don't worry about this. This could ruin your career. You might want to think about this. This could take down other people. And, they were really frustrated that even though they saw something abhorrent, their chain of command seemed unwilling to act.
Well, last month, President Trump tweeted, quote, in honor of his past service to our country, Navy SEAL Eddie Gallagher will soon be moved to less restrictive confinement while he awaits his day in court. Process should move quickly, President Trump tweeted. So, Dave, can you talk about that, the fact that President Trump has intervened on his behalf? This man, as the investigation finds, is not only accused of killing a 15-year-old boy who was an ISIS captive being treated by a medic when he was shot by Gallagher. He killed a girl in Raqqa, an older unarmed man. And even before this, in Iraq, what he did in Iraq, in Afghanistan, he had killed a little Afghan girl who was being held by a man who was Gallagher's target. He shot the girl and killed both of them to get to the man.
And stabbed the teenage boy.
That's right. So when Chief Gallagher was arrested in September, the Navy took a somewhat unusual move of asking that he be confined in the Navy brig until his trial. And the reason that they did is they say that they had found evidence that he was trying to intimidate witnesses and tamper with the investigation. And so they wanted him in a place where he couldn't do that. His family took up his cause, both his brother, Sean Gallagher, and his wife, Andrea Gallagher, saying, here's a man who's supposed to be innocent unless proven guilty. He hasn't had his day in court. He has a exemplary career, which is absolutely true. And yet he's being put in a cell before he's ever found guilty of anything. And they said that was absolutely outrageous. They said that the reason these allegations had come out was not because the SEAL chief had done anything wrong, but because his platoon was unable to meet his exacting standards.
Actually, Dave, we have Andrea Gallagher, the wife of Navy SEAL Eddie Gallagher, speaking with WVW-TV earlier this year.
Let's listen, because this leads to why Trump intervened.
He was named number one chief.
Number one chief.
He was tasked to clear Mosul, and he did it in half the time. So when Mattis said, take the gloves off, my husband listened.
So that's Eddie Gallagher's wife. Continue, Dave Phillips.
They made this case that in the media and really found resonance in conservative media outlets and in conservative lawmakers. So very quickly, a number of Republican congressmen, led by Duncan Hunter of California, signed on, demanding that he be let out of the brig. And they intervened directly, spoke directly to President Trump. President Trump,
and this is Duncan Hunter, who you just mentioned, the Republican Congress member from California.
You have lawyers that don't know what the word combat means, prosecuting guys for killing the enemy. So even if everything that the prosecution said is true, so let's say that Chief Gallagher killed a verified, designated ISIS combatant, my answer is, so what? That's his job, to close with and destroy the enemy through fire and close combat. That's what our military does. We would not have won World War I. We would not have won World War II if we would have fought the way that we have to fight now.
That's the indicted Congress member, Duncan Hunter, the Republican from California. Dave Phillips, describe what he is on trial for. For example, the knifing to death of this 15-year-old teenager.
What his platoon members told investigators is that the chief kind of went off the rails when he got to Mosul, Iraq. They were supposed to be in an advise and assist role supporting Iraqi special forces. And they were supposed to do some oversight with drones and snipers. His job was to be the tactical lead, the person who sits in the back and comes up with the plans. But instead, he spent much of his time in a hidden sniper hide where other snipers said he shot, depending on who you asked, 3 times as much or 20 times as much as other snipers. And as you mentioned at the top, he bragged about how many people he killed. Now, a lot of that may have just been boasting. We don't know how many of those shots actually hit anyone, but there are specifics where other snipers say they witnessed him killing what they saw as people who were clearly civilians. There was one case where a group of girls were walking along the river that runs through the center of the city, and one of the girls wearing a flowered hijab was shot down, and they watched her collapse, and her friends drag her away. In another case, a couple of old men in wispy white beards were along the river as well, and one of them was shot in the back. And the snipers say that in both these cases, it was Eddie Gallagher who took those shots.
And Dave,
now, the case that you mentioned at the top, sorry, go ahead.
We wanted to, very quickly before we conclude, what do you expect to come of the trial?
This is going to be really hard for a prosecutor to prove, as damning as the facts seem. This wasn't investigated until a year later because of the delays. Much of the physical evidence that might have been able to be taken was gone. There is no body for any of these murders. A lot of it comes down to testimony. And so I think that it's a very open question what happens.
And the killing of this teenager you were just about to say?
This is a captive. They called him an enemy, but clearly a captive fighter, someone who's protected by the Geneva Conventions and our own laws of war. He should have been cared for, and he was by the other SEALs. But what the SEALs say is then Edward Gallagher came over and, without really saying anything, took out a custom knife and stabbed him in the neck. and in the torso and killed him.
I want to thank you so much for being with us. Dave Phillips will certainly link to your expose in the New York Times. Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, correspondent for the Times. The piece headlined, Navy SEALs were warned against reporting their chief for war crimes. And that does it for our broadcast. I'll be speaking at the University of California, Berkeley, and we'll be showing our film 4 Days in Occupied Western Sahara, Africa's Last Colony. That's Saturday at 6 p.m. at the Genetics and Plant Biology building in Berkeley. Check our website. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh. Thanks so much for joining us.